Sarah Martinez had always been a fighter, but nothing could have prepared her for the battle that was about to consume her life. At 38 years old, she worked 2 jobs to support herself and her 17-year-old son, Marcus, in their small apartment in East Oakland. Her days started at 5 in the morning when she left for her job at the hospital cafeteria, and they often ended well past midnight when she finished her shift cleaning office buildings downtown. Despite the exhaustion that seemed to live in her bones, Sarah never complained. Everything she did was for Marcus, the bright, talented boy who had been her whole world since his father walked out when he was just 3 years old. Marcus was different from the other kids in their neighborhood. While many of his classmates had already dropped out of school or gotten caught up in the street life that dominated their area, Marcus had dreams that stretched far beyond the concrete walls of their housing project. He was a gifted artist, spending hours sketching elaborate drawings of cars, buildings, and faces with a precision that amazed his teachers. His bedroom walls were covered with his artwork, each piece more impressive than the last. Sarah often stood in his doorway, watching him work by the light of his desk lamp, his face scrunched in concentration as he brought his visions to life on paper. The art teacher at Marcus's high school had even talked to Sarah about the possibility of her son getting a scholarship to art college. The conversation had filled Sarah with hope she hadn't felt in years. She began picking up extra shifts, putting aside every spare dollar she could find, dreaming of the day when Marcus would walk across a college graduation stage. She imagined him in a cap and gown, holding a diploma that would open doors to a future she could only dream of for herself. But East Oakland had its own plans for young men like Marcus, and those plans rarely included college scholarships or bright futures. The Diablos Motorcycle Club had been recruiting heavily in their neighborhood for months. Sarah had seen their bikes parked outside the corner store, had heard the rumors about the money they offered kids who were willing to do small jobs for them. She had warned Marcus again and again to stay away from them, to keep his head down and focus on his art and his studies. On a Tuesday evening in late September, Sarah came home from her hospital job expecting to find Marcus at the kitchen table working on his homework as usual. Instead, she found an empty apartment that felt wrong the moment she stepped through the door. His backpack was gone, but his art supplies were scattered across his desk as if he had left in a hurry. The drawing he had been working on the night before, a detailed sketch of a vintage motorcycle, was left unfinished, his pencil still lying beside it. Sarah called Marcus's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She told herself not to panic, that he was probably just at a friend's house and had forgotten to tell her. But as the hours ticked by and there was no word from her son, the worry in her chest began to grow into something much darker. By midnight, she was calling every number she could think of, reaching out to his classmates, his teachers, anyone who might have seen him. The next morning, Sarah filed a missing person report with the Oakland Police Department. Officer Janet Williams, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who had clearly seen too much over the years, took down the information with practiced efficiency. She asked all the standard questions about Marcus's habits, his friends, his recent behavior. When Sarah mentioned her fears about the Diablos, Officer Williams's expression grew even more serious. The Diablos were not just another street gang. They were a highly organized criminal enterprise that had been operating in the Bay Area for over 20 years. Their leader, a man known only as King, had built an empire based on drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and human trafficking. The club was notorious for recruiting young men from disadvantaged neighborhoods, using a combination of money, protection, and intimidation to bring them into their organization. Once someone joined the Diablos, leaving was not an option. Officer Williams explained that the police had been trying to infiltrate the Diablos for years without success. The organization was structured like a fortress, with layers of protection around their leadership and their operations. Members were bound by a code of absolute loyalty, and breaking that code meant death. Even when they arrested lower-level members, they could never get anyone to talk about the inner workings of the organization. Sarah listened to all of this with growing horror. The idea that her son might be caught up in such a world seemed impossible. Marcus was a good kid, a smart kid. He had dreams and plans and a future ahead of him. How could he have gotten involved with people like this? Officer Williams assured her that they would do everything they could to find Marcus, but Sarah could see in her eyes that the woman didn't hold out much hope. Days turned into weeks with no word from Marcus and no progress from the police. Sarah found herself unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to focus on anything except finding her son. She took time off from both her jobs, spending her days driving through the neighborhoods where the Diablos were known to operate, looking for any sign of Marcus or his distinctive red jacket. She plastered missing person flyers on every telephone pole and bulletin board she could find, his smiling face staring back at her from grocery store windows and coffee shop walls. The community rallied around Sarah in her time of need. Her neighbors organized search parties, combing through abandoned buildings and empty lots. Her coworkers took up collections to help her with her bills while she was off work looking for Marcus. Local churches added his name to their prayer lists, and the story of his disappearance was featured on the evening news. But, despite all these efforts, there were no solid leads, no credible sightings, no evidence of what had happened to him. It was Sarah's neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who finally provided the break in the case that Sarah had been desperately hoping for. Mrs. Rodriguez was an elderly woman who spent most of her time sitting on her front porch, watching the comings and goings of the neighborhood with sharp eyes that missed very little. 3 weeks after Marcus disappeared, she pulled Sarah aside and told her in hushed tones about something she had seen the night he vanished. According to Mrs. Rodriguez, she had been sitting on her porch around 7 o'clock that evening when she saw Marcus walking down the street with 2 men she didn't recognize. The men were older, probably in their 20s, and they were dressed in the distinctive leather jackets that marked them as members of the Diablos. Marcus appeared to be going with them willingly, but there was something about his body language that had made Mrs. Rodriguez uneasy. He kept looking back toward his apartment building, as if he was having second thoughts about whatever he had agreed to do. Mrs. Rodriguez had wanted to tell someone about what she had seen right away, but she was afraid of what might happen to her if the Diablos found out she had been talking to the police. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that crossing the motorcycle club could have deadly consequences. But, seeing Sarah's obvious anguish day after day had finally convinced her to speak up, despite her fears. Armed with this new information, Sarah went back to Officer Williams and demanded that the police take more aggressive action. She wanted them to raid every Diablo's property in the city, to arrest every member they could find, to do whatever it took to bring her son home. But Officer Williams explained that the justice system didn't work that way. They needed concrete evidence, not just the testimony of one elderly witness. They needed search warrants and probable cause and all the other legal requirements that protected citizens from unlawful searches and seizures. Sarah left the police station that day feeling more frustrated and helpless than ever before. The system that was supposed to protect her son was failing him, tied up in red tape and legal procedures while he remained missing and possibly in danger. She realized that if Marcus was going to be found, she might have to find him herself. The thought terrified her, but her love for her son was stronger than her fear. That night, Sarah sat in Marcus's empty bedroom, surrounded by his artwork and his dreams, and made a decision that would change everything. She was going to find the Diablos, and she was going to get her son back, no matter what it took. She had no idea how dangerous this decision would prove to be, or how it would test every ounce of courage and determination she possessed. All she knew was that she was Marcus's mother, and she would not abandon him to whatever fate awaited him in the world he had disappeared into. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shock everyone involved and prove that sometimes the most unlikely people are capable of extraordinary acts of courage when the stakes are high enough. Sarah Martinez was about to embark on a journey that would take her into the heart of one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in California, armed with nothing but a mother's love and an unshakable determination to bring her child home. Sarah's transformation from grieving mother to determined investigator began in the most unlikely place, the public library. While the police seemed content to wait for leads that might never come, Sarah decided to learn everything she could about the organization that had taken her son. She spent hours reading newspaper articles about the Diablos, studying court records from their previous arrests, and mapping out the locations where they were known to operate. What she discovered painted a picture of an organization far more sophisticated and dangerous than she had initially understood. The Diablos weren't just a motorcycle club that happened to engage in criminal activity. They were a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise with connections that reached into law enforcement, local politics, and legitimate businesses throughout the Bay Area. Their influence extended far beyond the streets of East Oakland, with chapters in 6 different states and international connections to similar organizations in Mexico and Canada. The more Sarah learned, the more she realized why the police had been unable to penetrate their organization. The Diablos operated with military-like discipline and organization. New recruits went through an initiation process that could last for months, during which they were tested, trained, and gradually introduced to the club's criminal activities. Members who proved themselves loyal and capable could rise through the ranks, eventually earning the right to wear the full patch that marked them as true Diablos. But it was the club's recruitment methods that made Sarah's blood run cold. According to the article she read, the Diablos specifically targeted young men from disadvantaged backgrounds, offering them money, protection, and a sense of belonging that many of them had never experienced before. They preyed on kids who felt hopeless about their futures, who saw no other way to escape poverty and violence in their neighborhoods. Marcus, with his artistic talent and college dreams, seemed like an unlikely target, but Sarah began to understand that even the brightest kids could be vulnerable if they were approached at the right moment, in the right way. One article in particular caught Sarah's attention. It was a feature story about a former Diablos member named Tony Gutierrez who had managed to escape the organization and was now working with social services to help other young people avoid getting caught up in gang life. The article mentioned that Tony occasionally spoke at community centers and schools about his experiences. Sarah tracked down his contact information and called him, explaining her situation and begging him to meet with her. Tony agreed to meet Sarah at a small coffee shop in downtown Oakland, far from the neighborhoods where either of them might be recognized. He was a man in his early 30s with tattoos covering his arms and neck, the permanent reminders of his time with the Diablos. But his eyes were kind, and Sarah could see genuine concern in his expression when she told him about Marcus. According to Tony, the Diablos had been aggressively recruiting in East Oakland for the past several months because they were expanding their operations and needed fresh blood. They typically approached potential recruits through intermediaries, kids who were already involved with the organization but not yet full members. These intermediaries would identify promising targets and begin building relationships with them, gradually introducing them to the idea of joining the club. The process was carefully designed to make kids feel special and chosen. They would be invited to parties where they would meet older members who would treat them with respect and make them feel important. They would be given small amounts of money for doing minor favors, nothing that seemed particularly dangerous or illegal. By the time the kids realized what they were really getting into, they were already too deep to easily back out. Tony explained that once someone was brought into the Diablos organization, they were essentially prisoners. The club controlled every aspect of their lives, from where they lived to who they could associate with. Members who tried to leave faced severe consequences, ranging from brutal beatings to death. Even their families could become targets if someone tried to break away from the organization. But Tony also provided Sarah with something she desperately needed: hope. He told her that new recruits were typically held at a compound outside the city while they went through the initiation process. If Marcus had only been missing for a few weeks, there was a chance he was still at this facility and hadn't yet been fully integrated into the organization's criminal activities. The compound was heavily guarded and virtually impossible for outsiders to access, but it was a concrete location where Marcus might actually be found. Sarah pressed Tony for more details about the compound, but he was reluctant to share too much information. He warned her that any attempt to rescue Marcus would be extremely dangerous, not just for her but for Marcus as well. The Diablos didn't take kindly to interference in their operations, and they had no qualms about using violence to protect their interests. If Sarah was caught trying to infiltrate their compound, both she and Marcus could end up dead. But Sarah's desperation outweighed her fear. She begged Tony to help her, promising that she would find a way to compensate him for the risk he would be taking. Finally, moved by her obvious anguish and determination, Tony agreed to provide her with basic information about the compound's location and layout. But he made her promise that she would take this information to the police rather than trying to handle the situation herself. Sarah nodded and made the promise, knowing even as she spoke the words that she had no intention of keeping it. The police had already proven that they were either unable or unwilling to take the aggressive action needed to rescue Marcus. If her son was going to be saved, she was going to have to do it herself. The compound was located in a rural area about 40 miles east of Oakland, hidden among rolling hills and abandoned farmland. According to Tony, it consisted of several buildings surrounded by a high fence topped with razor wire. There were always guards on duty, and the facility was equipped with security cameras and motion sensors. The Diablos used it not only for training new recruits but also as a warehouse for drugs and stolen goods, making it one of their most important and heavily protected facilities. Tony drew Sarah a rough map of the compound's layout, showing her the locations of the main buildings and the guard posts. He explained that new recruits were typically housed in a dormitory-style building near the center of the compound, while full members stayed in smaller cabins closer to the perimeter. The facility also included a garage where stolen vehicles were stored and modified, a training area where recruits learned to fight and handle weapons, and a main lodge where the leadership conducted business. Most importantly, Tony told Sarah about the compound's security routines. The guards changed shifts at midnight and again at 6 in the morning, and there was typically a brief window during each change when security was at its lightest. The motion sensors were primarily focused on the perimeter fence, and there were a few blind spots in the camera coverage that a careful observer might be able to exploit. Sarah absorbed all this information like a sponge, asking detailed questions and taking careful notes. Tony watched her with growing concern, clearly recognizing that she was planning something far more dangerous than just passing the information along to the police. He tried once more to talk her out of whatever she was considering, reminding her that the Diablos had killed people for far less serious infractions than attempting to rescue one of their recruits. But Sarah's mind was already made up. She thanked Tony for his help and assured him that she would be careful, but she could see in his eyes that he knew she was lying. As she left the coffee shop, Tony called after her, telling her that if she was determined to go through with whatever she was planning, she should at least make sure she was properly prepared. The Diablos, he warned her, respected only one thing: strength. If she was going to confront them, she needed to make sure she could back up her words with action. That night, Sarah sat in her apartment staring at the map Tony had drawn for her, trying to work up the courage to put her desperate plan into action. She knew that what she was considering was incredibly dangerous, possibly suicidal. But the thought of Marcus trapped in that compound, possibly being forced to participate in criminal activities that would destroy his future, made her stomach turn. She had to try to save him, even if it meant putting her own life at risk. Sarah spent the next several days preparing for what she knew would be the most dangerous thing she had ever attempted. She drove out to the area around the compound, familiarizing herself with the roads and the terrain. She purchased dark clothing and basic camping gear, planning to approach the facility on foot under cover of darkness. Most importantly, she went to a gun shop in a neighboring county and, after passing a background check, purchased a small handgun and a box of ammunition. Sarah had never owned a gun before, and the weight of the weapon in her hands felt alien and terrifying. But she forced herself to go to a shooting range and practice until she felt comfortable handling the firearm. She told herself that she didn't intend to hurt anyone, that the gun was just for protection and intimidation. But, deep down, she knew that if it came down to a choice between her safety and Marcus's, she would do whatever was necessary to protect her son. The night before her planned infiltration of the compound, Sarah sat down and wrote a letter to Marcus, pouring out all the love and hope and fear that had been consuming her since his disappearance. She told him about his college scholarship possibilities, about the future that was still waiting for him if he could just get away from the people who had taken him. She sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it on his pillow, a tangible reminder of why she was about to risk everything. As she prepared to leave for the compound, Sarah looked around the apartment that she and Marcus had shared, trying to memorize every detail in case she never saw it again. She picked up one of his drawings, a sketch of the two of them sitting together on their couch, and slipped it into her pocket. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she wanted to carry a piece of her son's dreams with her. Sarah had no way of knowing that her desperate plan was about to intersect with events far beyond her control, and that her love for her son was about to put her in the middle of a war between the Diablos and their enemies. The compound she was planning to infiltrate was not just a training facility for new recruits. It was also the headquarters for the club's most sensitive criminal operations, and there were people who would kill to get inside those walls. Sarah Martinez was about to walk into a situation that was far more dangerous and complex than she could possibly have imagined. The drive to the compound took Sarah through winding country roads that seemed to grow darker and more isolated with each passing mile. She had left Oakland at 10 o'clock at night, giving herself plenty of time to reach the facility and find a good vantage point before the midnight guard change that Tony had told her about. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, and she could feel her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that seemed to echo the ticking of the dashboard clock. As she approached the general area where the compound was supposed to be located, Sarah pulled off the main road and parked her car in a grove of trees about half a mile away from her target. She sat in the darkness for several minutes, trying to calm her nerves and run through her plan one more time. The idea was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. She would approach the compound on foot, find a way to get inside during the guard change, locate Marcus, and somehow get both of them out safely before anyone realized what was happening. Sarah knew that the plan had a dozen different ways it could go wrong, but she also knew that she couldn't live with herself if she didn't at least try to save her son. She checked her backpack one more time, making sure she had everything she might need: a flashlight, zip ties, a first aid kit, and the gun that felt like it weighed 100 pounds in her jacket pocket. She had practiced drawing the weapon quickly and smoothly, but she prayed that she wouldn't actually need to use it. The walk through the darkness was harder than Sarah had expected. The terrain was uneven and filled with holes and obstacles that she couldn't see until she was almost on top of them. Twice she stumbled and nearly fell, the sound of her footsteps seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet night. But gradually, she began to make out the glow of lights ahead of her, and she realized she was approaching the compound. Sarah's first glimpse of the Diablos facility was more intimidating than she had imagined. The place looked like a small military base, with high fences topped with coils of razor wire and guard towers at each corner. Bright floodlights illuminated the perimeter, and she could see the dark shapes of guards moving along the fence line. The buildings inside the compound were low and utilitarian, designed for function rather than comfort. Following Tony's directions, Sarah made her way around the perimeter until she found the blind spot in the camera coverage that he had told her about. It was a section of fence near the back of the compound where a large tree cast a shadow that obscured the view from the nearest security camera. The area was still within sight of one of the guard towers, but Tony had assured her that the guards typically focused their attention on the front and sides of the facility rather than the back. Sarah crouched in the shadow of the tree and waited for the midnight guard change, watching the movements of the security personnel and trying to time their routines. At exactly 12 o'clock, she saw several guards walk toward the main building while others emerged to take their places. For about 5 minutes, there was confusion and movement as the new shift got organized and the old shift prepared to leave. That 5-minute window was Sarah's chance, and she took it. She sprinted from the tree line to the fence, pulled out a pair of wire cutters she had brought, and began working on the chain link. The metal was tougher than she had expected, and precious minutes ticked by as she struggled to cut a hole large enough to crawl through. By the time she finally managed to create an opening, the guard change was over and the compound had settled into its regular nighttime routine. Sarah squeezed through the hole in the fence, tearing her jacket on the sharp edges of the cut wire. She found herself in a narrow alley between two buildings, hidden from view but terrifyingly exposed if anyone happened to walk by. She pressed herself against the wall of the nearest building and tried to get her bearings, comparing what she could see to the rough map Tony had drawn for her. The building where new recruits were supposedly housed was about 100 yards away, across an open courtyard that was illuminated by floodlights. Sarah realized that reaching it would require crossing that open space, and she would be visible to anyone who happened to be looking out a window or standing guard. But there was no other way to get there, and she had come too far to turn back now. Sarah waited until she was sure no one was moving around the compound, then sprinted across the courtyard as quietly as she could manage. She reached the dormitory building without being detected and pressed herself against its wall, breathing heavily and trying to calm her racing heart. Now came the hard part, getting inside and finding Marcus without alerting anyone to her presence. The building had several windows along its ground floor, and Sarah moved from one to another, trying to peer inside without being seen. Most of the windows were covered with heavy curtains or blinds, but she finally found one with a gap that allowed her to see into what appeared to be a common room. There were several young men inside, some playing cards, others watching television, all of them wearing the same clothes and all of them looking like they would rather be somewhere else. Sarah's heart nearly stopped when she spotted Marcus sitting at a table in the corner of the room. He looked thinner than she remembered, and there was a haunted expression in his eyes that hadn't been there before. But he was alive and apparently unharmed, and the relief that flooded through Sarah was so intense that she nearly cried out. She had found her son, and now she had to figure out how to get him out. The problem was that Marcus was not alone. There were at least 6 other young men in the room with him, and Sarah could see an older man who was clearly a full member of the Diablos sitting near the door, apparently keeping watch over the recruits. The man was armed, and Sarah realized that any attempt to communicate with Marcus would likely result in a confrontation that she was not prepared to handle. As Sarah tried to figure out her next move, she heard voices approaching from somewhere behind her. She pressed herself against the wall and tried to make herself invisible, but the voices were getting closer and she realized that someone was coming around the corner of the building. In desperation, she looked for somewhere to hide and spotted a large garbage bin about 20 feet away. She sprinted for it and crouched behind it just as 2 guards rounded the corner. The guards were having a casual conversation about their duties, and they walked past Sarah's hiding spot without noticing her. But their presence reminded her just how dangerous her situation really was. She was alone in the middle of a heavily guarded criminal compound, armed with nothing but a handgun and a desperate plan that was already falling apart. If she was caught, both she and Marcus would likely be killed. But even as these thoughts raced through her mind, Sarah spotted something that gave her hope. One of the guards had left a key ring hanging from his belt, and she realized that those keys might provide access to the building where Marcus was being held. If she could somehow get those keys, she might be able to create a distraction that would allow her to reach her son. Sarah waited until the guards had moved on, then began following them at a distance, staying in the shadows and trying not to make any noise. She watched as they completed their patrol route and returned to a small guardhouse near the main gate. Through the windows of the guardhouse, she could see 3 men sitting around a table, drinking coffee and playing cards. The keys she had seen were hanging on a hook near the door. The plan that formed in Sarah's mind was desperate and dangerous, but it was the only option she could think of. She would wait until the guards were distracted by their card game, then sneak into the guardhouse and steal the keys. With any luck, she could get in and out before anyone noticed, and then use the keys to access the building where Marcus was being held. But as Sarah prepared to put her plan into action, she heard the sound of motorcycles approaching the compound from the main road. The rumble of engines grew louder and louder until it seemed to shake the ground beneath her feet. Car headlights swept across the compound as a convoy of vehicles approached the main gate, and Sarah realized that something big was happening. She watched from her hiding spot as the gates opened and a parade of motorcycles and cars entered the compound. The vehicles were filled with Diablo's members, all of them armed and, all of them looking like they were preparing for war. Sarah counted at least 20 motorcycles and half a dozen cars, far more people than she had expected to encounter at the facility. As the new arrivals parked their vehicles and began unloading weapons and equipment, Sarah began to understand that she had chosen the worst possible night for her rescue attempt. Something major was happening at the compound, some kind of operation that had brought together a large portion of the Diablo's membership. The facility was now crawling with dangerous criminals, all of them on high alert and ready for trouble. But Sarah also realized that the confusion created by the arrivals might actually work to her advantage. With so many people moving around the compound, it might be easier for her to blend in and move around without being noticed. The guards' attention would be focused on the new arrivals rather than on watching for intruders. Sarah made her decision. She would use the confusion to make her move, knowing that this might be her only chance to reach Marcus before the situation became even more dangerous. She checked her gun one more time, said a silent prayer for both their safety, and prepared to step out of the shadows and into the most dangerous situation of her life. What she didn't know was that the Diablos were preparing for a war with a rival organization, and that the compound was about to become a battlefield. Sarah Martinez was about to find herself in the middle of a violent conflict that would test every ounce of courage she possessed. The chaos that erupted at the compound began with the distant sound of gunfire echoing across the hills. Sarah was still crouched behind the garbage bin, trying to work up the courage to make her move toward the guardhouse, when the first shots rang out from somewhere beyond the perimeter fence. The sound sent a chill down her spine, but it was nothing compared to the reaction of the Diablo's members throughout the compound. Within seconds, the facility transformed from a quiet criminal hideout into a military-style fortress preparing for battle. Floodlights that had been dark suddenly blazed to life, illuminating every corner of the compound with harsh white light. Sirens began wailing, and Sarah could hear shouted orders as members of the organization grabbed weapons and took up defensive positions. The card game in the guardhouse was forgotten as the three men inside rushed out with assault rifles, their casual demeanor replaced by grim determination. Sarah realized that she had stumbled into the middle of something far bigger than a simple rescue mission. The Diablos were under attack, and the compound had become a war zone. Her first instinct was to run, to abandon her plan and try to escape before the situation became even more dangerous. But then, she thought about Marcus, trapped inside that building with no idea what was happening and no way to protect himself if the violence spread throughout the compound. The attacking force, which Sarah later learned was a rival motorcycle club called the Iron Wolves, had been planning this assault for months. The Iron Wolves had once been allies of the Diablos, but a dispute over territory and drug trafficking routes had turned them into bitter enemies. They had been watching the compound for weeks, waiting for the right moment to strike at the heart of the Diablos' operation. The timing of the attack was no accident. The Iron Wolves knew that the Diablos were planning a major drug shipment and that many of their key members would be at the compound that night to oversee the operation. What they hadn't counted on was the presence of Sarah Martinez, a desperate mother who was about to become an unwitting participant in their war. As the sound of gunfire grew closer, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of running away from the danger, she began moving toward it. The building where Marcus was being held was now between her and the main gate where the heaviest fighting was taking place. If she was going to reach her son, she would have to cross through the middle of what was rapidly becoming a battlefield. Sarah pulled out her gun and checked to make sure it was loaded, her hands shaking with adrenaline and fear. She had never imagined that she would find herself in a situation like this, armed and moving through gunfire to rescue her child. But the maternal instinct that had driven her this far was stronger than her terror, and she forced herself to keep moving forward. The first body Sarah encountered was a young Diablos member who couldn't have been much older than Marcus. He was lying face down near the corner of a building, his leather jacket soaked with blood. Sarah had to fight back the urge to be sick as she stepped over him, reminding herself that Marcus was counting on her to be strong. As she approached the dormitory building, Sarah could see that the situation inside had changed dramatically. The casual atmosphere she had observed through the window was gone, replaced by panic and confusion. The young recruits were pressed against the walls, trying to stay away from the windows, while the older member who had been guarding them was speaking rapidly into a radio, clearly trying to get instructions from his superiors. Sarah realized that the chaos might actually work in her favor. With everyone focused on the attack, it might be easier for her to get inside and reach Marcus. But she also knew that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The longer the battle raged, the more likely it was that someone would be sent to move the recruits to a more secure location, or worse, that the fighting would spread to their building. The front door of the dormitory was locked, but Sarah noticed that one of the windows had been left slightly open. She made her way around to the side of the building, staying low and trying to avoid being seen by anyone inside. The window was about 7 feet off the ground, but there was a drain pipe running up the wall that she thought she could use to climb up. As Sarah pulled herself up toward the window, she could hear voices inside the building becoming more agitated. The guard was shouting orders at the recruits, telling them to stay away from the windows and to prepare to move if necessary. Sarah could hear Marcus's voice among the others, and the sound gave her strength to keep climbing even though her arms were beginning to ache from the effort. Sarah managed to reach the window and peer inside just as the guard was distributing weapons to some of the older recruits. The sight of her 17-year-old son being handed a pistol filled her with a rage she had never experienced before. These people had taken her child, the boy who drew pictures and dreamed of college, and they were turning him into a criminal. The transformation from worried mother to fierce protector was instantaneous and absolute. Without thinking about the consequences, Sarah pushed the window open and dropped into the room, landing hard on the floor and rolling to absorb the impact. The sound of her entry caused everyone in the room to turn toward her, their faces showing a mixture of surprise and confusion. For a moment, nobody moved, as if they were all trying to process what they were seeing. The Diablo's guard was the first to react, reaching for his weapon and shouting at Sarah to identify herself. But Sarah was already moving, her gun in her hand and her eyes locked on her son. She had trained at the shooting range, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of pointing a weapon at another human being. Her hand was steady, though, and her voice was clear when she spoke. Marcus looked at his mother in shock, unable to believe that she was really there in the middle of the compound. He started to move toward her, but the guard grabbed his arm and pulled him back, using him as a human shield while he tried to figure out how to handle the situation. The other recruits scattered to the corners of the room, clearly terrified by the sudden appearance of an armed stranger. Sarah had imagined this moment 100 different ways during her drive to the compound, but the reality was nothing like what she had expected. Her son was alive and within reach, but he was also being held by a dangerous criminal who would not hesitate to hurt him if he felt threatened. The sound of gunfire from outside was getting closer, and Sarah knew that she had only minutes, perhaps less, to resolve the situation and get Marcus to safety. The standoff that followed lasted only seconds but felt like hours. Sarah kept her gun trained on the guard while he held Marcus, neither of them willing to make the first move. The other recruits watched in terrified silence, clearly unsure whether they should try to help their captor or stay out of the way. Marcus looked back and forth between his mother and his guard, his face showing a mixture of hope and fear. It was the guard who broke the stalemate, making the mistake of underestimating the determination of a mother protecting her child. He loosened his grip on Marcus slightly while he reached for his radio, intending to call for backup. That moment of distraction was all Sarah needed. She had never shot anyone before, had never even imagined that she would be capable of such violence. But when she saw her opportunity to save her son, all of her doubts and fears disappeared. Sarah squeezed the trigger, and the guard went down with a cry of pain and surprise. The bullet had hit him in the shoulder, not a fatal wound but enough to make him drop his weapon and release his hold on Marcus. Marcus ran to his mother, and Sarah wrapped her free arm around him while keeping her gun pointed at the wounded guard. She could feel her son shaking against her, whether from fear or relief or shock she couldn't tell. But he was alive and safe, and, for a moment, that was all that mattered. The other recruits in the room were backing away from them, clearly unsure what to do now that their guard was wounded and an armed stranger was in control of the situation. Sarah realized that she needed to get Marcus out of the compound immediately, before more guards arrived and the situation became impossible to handle. But, as she began moving toward the window she had entered through, Sarah heard heavy footsteps in the hallway outside the room. The sound of the gunshot had attracted attention, and she could hear voices shouting orders as what sounded like several armed men approached the door. Sarah realized that her escape route was about to be cut off, and that she and Marcus might be trapped in the building with nowhere to run. The door burst open and 3 more Diablos members entered the room, their weapons drawn and their faces showing the kind of cold determination that Sarah had only seen in movies. They took in the scene quickly, their wounded colleague on the floor, the armed woman holding a gun on them, and the recruit they had been training standing beside her. Sarah knew that she was outgunned and outnumbered, but she also knew that surrendering was not an option. These men would kill both her and Marcus rather than let them leave the compound as witnesses to what they had seen. Her only chance was to convince them that she was more dangerous than they realized, that attacking her would cost them more than they were willing to pay. So Sarah Martinez, the hospital cafeteria worker who had never hurt anyone in her life, looked her son's captors in the eyes and said the words that would become legendary in the criminal underworld of Oakland, "I'm here to get my son, and I'm not leaving without him." The gun in her hand was steady, her voice was calm, and there was something in her expression that made even hardened criminals think twice about challenging her. What happened next would depend on whether the Diablos believed that this ordinary-looking woman in her torn jacket was really prepared to fight to the death for her child. Sarah was about to find out if a mother's love was really stronger than the violence and intimidation that had controlled her son's life for the past month. The standoff in the dormitory room lasted for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds. Sarah kept her gun trained on the 3 Diablos members while they tried to decide how to handle the situation. Outside, the sound of gunfire was getting closer and more intense, suggesting that the Iron Wolves were making significant progress in their assault on the compound. Sarah could see uncertainty in the eyes of the men facing her, torn between dealing with her and responding to the larger threat to their organization. The leader of the 3 men, a heavily tattooed individual who introduced himself as Razor, tried to negotiate with Sarah. He explained that Marcus had joined the Diablos voluntarily, that he was being trained for important work, and that interfering with the club's business was a mistake that could have serious consequences for her and her family. His tone was reasonable, almost friendly, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes as he looked for an opportunity to disarm her. Sarah's response was simple and direct. She didn't care about the Diablos' business, she didn't care about their war with whoever was attacking the compound, and she didn't care about the consequences of her actions. All she wanted was to take her son home, and she was prepared to shoot anyone who tried to stop her. The conviction in her voice seemed to surprise the men facing her, as if they hadn't expected to encounter such fierce determination from someone who looked so ordinary. It was Marcus who broke the stalemate, stepping forward and addressing Razor directly. He told the man that he had made a mistake in joining the Diablos, that he wanted to leave and go home with his mother. He apologized for any inconvenience his departure might cause, but he was firm in his decision to walk away from the organization. Sarah felt a surge of pride as she listened to her son speak with a maturity and courage that reminded her of the boy she had raised. But Razor's response made it clear that leaving the Diablos was not a simple matter of changing one's mind. He explained that Marcus had been given access to sensitive information about the organization's operations, and that allowing him to leave would create a security risk that the club could not tolerate. The implication was clear: Marcus knew too much to be allowed to walk away alive. The conversation was interrupted by an explosion that shook the entire building, followed by the sound of automatic gunfire very close by. Through the windows, Sarah could see muzzle flashes and smoke as the battle between the 2 motorcycle clubs intensified. One of the men with Razor spoke urgently into his radio, reporting that they needed immediate backup at the dormitory building. Sarah realized that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. More Diablo's members would arrive soon, and, the longer she waited, the harder it would become to escape with Marcus. But, she also understood that simply walking out the door was not an option with 3 armed men blocking their path. She needed to create a distraction or find another way out of the building. The solution came from an unexpected source, the wounded guard she had shot earlier. Despite his injury, he had managed to crawl to a panic button near the door, and, when he pressed it, sirens began wailing throughout the compound. The sound was apparently a signal for all personnel to evacuate to secure positions, because Razor and his men immediately became agitated and began talking rapidly about their need to reach the main bunker. Sarah saw her chance and took it. She grabbed Marcus's hand and began backing toward the window she had entered through, keeping her gun pointed at the 3 men. She told them that they were leaving, and that anyone who tried to follow them would be shot. The men seemed torn between pursuing her and responding to the evacuation order, giving Sarah precious seconds to reach the window. Getting Marcus out the window was more difficult than Sarah had anticipated. He was taller and heavier than her, and the drop to the ground was significant enough to be dangerous. But, with gunfire erupting all around the compound and the sound of shouting voices getting closer, they had no choice but to take the risk. Sarah went first, dropping to the ground and, then, positioning herself to catch Marcus as he jumped. The landing was hard and painful, with both of them ending up in a tangled heap on the ground. Sarah felt something in her ankle twist as she hit, sending a sharp pain shooting up her leg. But, adrenaline kept her moving, and she pulled Marcus to his feet as they heard voices shouting from inside the building behind them. They had seconds before someone came looking for them. Sarah's plan had been to retrace her steps back to the hole she had cut in the fence, but the compound had become a war zone since her arrival, and that route was now blocked by fighting between the 2 motorcycle clubs. She could see muzzle flashes and hear the crack of bullets hitting concrete as the Iron Wolves pressed their attack toward the center of the facility. Getting back to her original entry point would mean crossing directly through the middle of the battle. Instead, Sarah began leading Marcus toward the back of the compound, hoping to find another section of fence that they could breach or climb over. The pain in her ankle was getting worse with each step, but she forced herself to keep moving. Behind them, she could hear voices as the Diablo's members discovered their escape route and began organizing a search. The back section of the compound was less heavily fortified than the front, but it was still surrounded by the same high fence topped with razor wire. Sarah began looking for any weakness in the barrier, any place where they might be able to get through or over. Marcus, meanwhile, was scanning the area for guards or security cameras that might detect their presence. They found their salvation in the form of a large tree that had grown close enough to the fence for its branches to hang over into the compound. The tree was on the outside of the barrier, but its trunk was thick enough and close enough that they might be able to climb it from inside and, then, drop down on the other side. It would be dangerous, especially for Sarah with her injured ankle, but it seemed like their best option. Getting to the tree required crossing another open area, and Sarah could see that there were guards moving through the compound in response to the alert that had been sounded. She and Marcus would have to time their movement carefully to avoid being spotted. They waited until a group of guards passed by, then sprinted across the open space as quickly and quietly as they could manage. Climbing the tree was one of the most difficult things Sarah had ever done. The bark was rough and painful against her hands, and her injured ankle made it hard to find secure footing on the branches. But Marcus was below her, helping to support her weight and guide her feet to the stronger branches. The sound of his voice, encouraging her and telling her she could do it, gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. When they reached the level of the fence, they could see that the razor wire extended several feet in each direction, making it impossible to simply swing over to the other side. Instead, they would have to crawl out along a branch that extended beyond the wire, then drop down to the ground outside the compound. The branch looked strong enough to support their weight, but the drop would be at least 15 feet, onto hard ground that could seriously injure them. Sarah went first, inching her way out along the branch while trying not to look down at the ground below. The branch swayed under her weight, and she could hear it creaking ominously as she moved further from the trunk. When she reached the point where she was clear of the razor wire, she took a deep breath and let go. The landing was brutal. Sarah hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact but still feeling something crack in her ribs. For a moment she couldn't breathe, and she lay on the ground gasping for air while Marcus called down to her from the tree. But she forced herself to get up and move away from the base of the tree, making room for her son to follow. Marcus's landing was somewhat better, though he too hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of him. But they were both outside the compound now, and Sarah could hear that the battle inside was beginning to die down. Whether the Iron Wolves had achieved their objectives or been repelled, the immediate danger was passing. But they weren't safe yet. Sarah knew that the Diablos would be looking for them, and that staying in the area would be extremely dangerous. Her car was still parked in the grove of trees half a mile away, and getting there would require crossing open country while injured and exhausted. But it was their only chance of escape, so they began walking, supporting each other and trying to stay alert for any signs of pursuit. The walk to the car seemed to take forever. Sarah's ankle was swelling and her ribs sent sharp pains through her chest with each breath, while Marcus had scratches and bruises from their escape through the window and over the fence. But they kept moving, driven by the knowledge that their freedom and possibly their lives depended on reaching safety. When they finally reached Sarah's car, she was so exhausted and relieved that she nearly collapsed against the driver's side door. But Marcus took the keys from her and helped her into the passenger seat, then got behind the wheel himself. He had only had his license for a few months, but he drove carefully and competently as they made their way back toward Oakland, both of them constantly checking the mirrors for signs that they were being followed. The drive home gave them time to talk for the first time since the rescue. Marcus explained how he had been approached by Diablo's recruiters at school, how they had gradually drawn him into their world with promises of money and excitement. He had realized his mistake within the first few days at the compound, but by then, it had been too late to simply leave. The training had been brutal, designed to break down the recruits' individuality and rebuild them as loyal soldiers for the organization. Sarah listened to her son's story with a mixture of anger and relief, angry at the people who had manipulated him but relieved that he had not been permanently damaged by the experience. She could see that Marcus had learned from what he had been through, that he understood how close he had come to destroying his future. The experience had matured him in ways that worried her but also made her proud of the young man he was becoming. When they reached their apartment, Sarah's first priority was to call Officer Williams and report that Marcus had been found. The conversation was complicated, because Sarah had to explain how she had located her son without admitting to the illegal activities she had engaged in at the compound. She told the officer that Marcus had escaped on his own during some kind of disturbance at the facility where he was being held, and that he had called her to pick him up. Officer Williams was clearly suspicious of this explanation, but she was also relieved that the case had been resolved without anyone being killed. She arranged for detectives to interview Marcus about his experience, but she also made it clear that the police would need concrete evidence and testimony if they were going to pursue charges against the Diablos. Both Sarah and Marcus understood that speaking out against the motorcycle club would put them in danger, but they also knew that their silence would allow the organization to continue victimizing other young people. In the weeks that followed, Marcus provided detailed information about the Diablos' recruitment methods and training procedures to law enforcement. His testimony, combined with information from other sources, led to several arrests and the eventual closure of the compound where he had been held. The Iron Wolves' attack had severely damaged the organization's operations, and the additional law enforcement attention made it difficult for them to rebuild. Marcus returned to school and threw himself into his art with a passion that surprised even Sarah. The experience with the Diablos had given him a new appreciation for the opportunities he had been given and a determination not to waste them. His grades improved dramatically, and his artwork became more sophisticated and emotionally complex. The art teacher who had originally talked to Sarah about college scholarships contacted several programs, and Marcus was eventually accepted to a prestigious art school with a full scholarship. Sarah never spoke publicly about what she had done to rescue her son, but the story spread through the community anyway. Word got out that a single mother had somehow infiltrated a heavily guarded criminal compound and brought her child home safely, and the tale grew in the telling. Some people didn't believe it was possible, but others saw Sarah as a symbol of what parents would do to protect their children. The physical injuries Sarah sustained during the rescue healed relatively quickly, but the emotional impact of that night stayed with her for much longer. She had nightmares about the violence she had witnessed and participated in, and she struggled with the knowledge that she had shot someone, even though it was in defense of her son. But she also felt a sense of empowerment that she had never experienced before, a confidence that came from having faced her worst fears and emerged victorious. Years later, when Marcus graduated from art school and began building a successful career as a graphic designer, he would often talk about the night his mother saved him. He understood better than anyone the courage it had taken for her to walk into that compound alone, and he never forgot the sacrifice she had made for him. The bond between them, already strong, became unbreakable as a result of what they had endured together. Sarah Martinez never had to use a gun again after that night, but she kept the weapon as a reminder of what she was capable of when someone she loved was threatened. She had discovered that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when the stakes were high enough, and that a mother's love truly was one of the most powerful forces in the world. The quiet hospital worker had become a warrior when her child needed her, and both she and Marcus were forever changed by the experience they had shared. When desperation meets determination, ordinary people become extraordinary heroes. This is the true story of Sarah Martinez, a single mother whose quiet life was shattered when her teenage son disappeared into the dangerous world of motorcycle gangs. What happened next would test every ounce of courage she possessed and prove that a mother's love knows no boundaries. In a world where violence rules the streets and fear keeps people silent, one woman refused to back down. Armed with nothing but unwavering determination and a mother's fierce protective instinct, she walked straight into the lion's den to reclaim what was most precious to her. This is not just a story about crime and punishment, it's about the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child, and the lengths one person will go to protect their family. The events that unfolded would shock a community, challenge everything the police thought they knew about gang warfare, and prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most desperate circumstances. What started as a missing person case would become a testament to the power of love, courage, and the refusal to give up when everything seems lost.